When I was in college, a friend had gone through a really difficult loss and had some time of grieving, but then it seemed that she was isolating herself. So a group of us decided we would make her some of her favorite food and bring her flowers. And so there was this day that we went to her place. This is before you're not texting people. I am that old. So we go to her place, we knock on the door, a few of us, we have the food, we have the flowers. She opens the door, her eyes grow wide with a surprise, and then they narrow, and she says, "I just want to be left alone," and gently closed the door. Have you ever reached out to someone offering help, seeking to be of service, and you were pushed back? Have you ever been the person where other people reached out to you in a place of perhaps your distress or isolation, and you push back? "Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine." Certainly, there are healthy rhythms of solitude, practices of having some time to be on our own, time to process, time to ponder, time to pray, time to sort through the things, sometimes time to lick our wounds. But there's this witness in the scriptures and the stories that in the long haul, in the overall arc of life, isolation isn't the best way to go, that we are better together. In the second creation story in Genesis, after God makes the first human being, God looks at this human and says, "It's not good that the human be alone." It's not good that the human be alone. And some of us, we've connected online. Some of us are here in person. There's something in us that recognizes, yeah, all right, there might be something to that, right? Being with other people. But still, it can be really hard. Many of us have experienced things throughout our lives, some of us in early childhood, where people we were supposed to be able to trust to care for us or to watch out for us didn't. Some of them neglected, some of them did harm, and so we learned distrust of the goodness of people, some of us early on. And then you do not make it into adulthood without some experiences of people who betrayed or hurt or teased or taunted or something. And then there's just the natural biological fight or flight when we're in trouble or when we feel challenged. And usually fighting or fleeing is seen as a solo endeavor. And so there's a lot in us that might try to go it alone, even if we understand intellectually or spiritually or theologically that it's better together. There's also this recognition in the faith tradition that going it alone isn't just not better, it's really bad, ultimately. Paul puts it quite bluntly in one of his letters to an early follower community. He said, "The wages of sin is death." And I know a lot of us here, we hear the word sin and we think bad actions or bad deeds. But in the languages of the scripture, sin, first and foremost, the heart of what sin is missing the mark or wandering off the path. And the path is communion with God, communion with each other, being at one with our own belovedness. And so sin means to be separated or alienated from that. And then often if we're in that place of separation or alienation, we're more likely to feel scarcity and fear or selfishness, and therefore we're more likely to do harm to ourselves or to others. But at the heart of the matter, it's alienation or separation from God, from others, and the truth of who we are as God's beloved. And Paul says that's a dead end. That's no way to be. And there's different sociological and psychological research that backs up that spiritual understanding that humans in isolation do not thrive, ultimately. Humans, for the most part, in isolation do not thrive. Now, there was, back in the 13th century, someone who did an experiment and accidentally found that result. King Frederick II, there's a story that he wanted to find out in the Holy Roman Empire, what language would humans speak if no one taught us language? Well, orphanage, children without connection, right? And so he offered this instruction that the people caring for children in an orphanage were to not teach the children language or to not teach them how to speak. And furthermore, to make sure they're avoiding like even little coups or words of affirmation, they were to feed the babies, they were to clothe and clean the babies, but they were not to hold or really touch the babies. And so we wonder, what language will they speak in this place of isolation? Well, according to the story, he never found out because not a single child survived. So there's something to this idea that we need each other, that we need community. And I believe this is why Jesus, who doesn't give lots of step-by-step instructions, as I mentioned in our lighting of the Christ candle conversation, we do not have a lot of do this, do this, do this. Jesus tells lots of stories. We got parables. We've got some teachings, but mostly it's like love God, love neighbor as yourself. Not lots of instruction. But here we have this instruction because Jesus is recognizing that in places of alienation, it's really important to do what we can to reconnect. So the story, as you heard, that in terms of his instruction, it starts out, he says, if a member of the church sins against you. So first recognize, member of the church is not an institution with a building, right? In the time that Matthew's gospel is written, these are house communities of worshipers. So much more intimate is the idea. But he's also saying, what he's about to say works for members of the faith community. These are not general instructions for living, because he's recognizing that the members of the church, in that sense, live by a different covenant. They have committed to seeking God first and committed to one another. And so they've agreed to that. That's what they're agreeing to live in. And so when things go sideways there, you're breaking the covenant. So there's a different understanding. They're not general principles. And he says, so if a member of the committed faith community, of people in covenant, sin against you. So likely what he means is they've done something that hurt you in some way. But again, remember, the heart of what sin is separation. It's alienation. It's isolation. So Jesus is saying, so when the conditions are such that someone's living alienated from God, from others, from who they are as God's beloved, you need to do something about it. So, what do you do? Well, let's first look at what you don't do. Jesus did not say if someone sins against you or is alienated, make sure you talk with a whole bunch of other people in the parking lot about them. He does not say, write snarky comments in their social media feed. And he does not say, send an anonymous letter. And just by the way, I've been here 4 years. There's only been 2 anonymous letters, but I'm just going to tell folk, anonymous letters have never healed or helped anything in the history of Christianity. So Jesus does not say that's the way forward. What he does say is, talk to the person directly. I know it seems simple, but it's hard, right? It's hard. Well, I don't want to be in conflict. I don't want to, what if I got it wrong? I mean, right, there's all kinds of stories we can tell ourselves about why we wouldn't. But Jesus is in this place in terms of separation or alienation. He's saying, if you see something, say something. And it's meant to be an act of love. Because if the heart of the matter is someone's alienated, disconnected, well, that's a dead end. That's not life-giving. You want them to be reconnected. So what can you do in that is what Jesus is inviting people to consider. He says, so talk to them. And not shaming them in some public forum, right? Talk to them. And he says, if they hear you, you regain them. Which reminds us that the whole idea is, in the reflecting back to the person, what's happened, the alienation, the whole point is regaining, reconnecting, communing again. Yay! Except there's step 2 and 3. Because Jesus also knows we get pretty habituated in alienation and separation. Right? We get used to whatever we're used to. So if we're operating in a sense of on our own and maybe we're doing harm to other people, well, we've practiced that probably for a while, and one person telling us about it, well, remember, of course, denial is not just a river in Egypt. It's very powerful. So he says, so get another person or two to come and connect with that person. And this is not about ganging up to shame someone. And I say that because churches have done it that way. And this is not what Jesus is talking about. Remember, the problem is separation and alienation. So what are you going to show them? Community and connection. Where 2 or more are gathered, Jesus says, there am I in the midst. So come together, a small group of people, to embody love and care for the person. You also are, we might say, expanding the mirror. right? One person's holding up the mirror, and the person say, yeah, whatever. But now there's several people holding up the same mirror, and it's just harder to ignore. And so again, the point, though, is to help the person reconnect. And he says, and if they don't listen to you, bring the church. And again, this is not a 200 or 500 member institution, right? These are house communities. So it'd be more like today, be like, bring your small group. But the idea is love them more and more. Offer a bigger reflection in love with the idea of helping the person to use Paul's language, wake up to what's happening, to the disconnect. And Jesus is not codependent. Jesus does not say, well, and then just keep coercing them until they come back. He does at the end, he's like, if you do this, you witness to what you can, then you let it go. Doesn't mean they can't ever come back at some point, but you stop actively pursuing, because then you're moving into unhealthy territory. So you let them go. But it's after all of this extravagant love that starts with one, and then it multiplies and multiplies and magnifies, inviting people back into the circle of love with God and with each other. And Jesus had already taught or shown ways to stay on the path. I mean, his whole ministry is helping people stay on the path, right? Modeling both prayer in the morning, prayer at night, meditation, contemplation, knowing the stories, being in community, sharing in meals. He's saying this is what you do. And Paul's talking about that too in his letter when he's saying stay awake and put on the armor of light. Paul's talking about there's things we do to stay connected, and there's things we do that disconnect us. So Paul happens to be naming in the part of the letter that we heard in our lectionary, he's naming the ways we get disconnected. And he's got his list, drunkenness, etc. So if there's things you know that get you isolated or disconnected, he's saying let go of those and do the things that keep you in the light, that keep you awake. So for me, Paul would have put on the list my cell phone. That's what he would tell me. Not ever touch it, but this, ironically, and I bet some of us know this thing that's supposed to keep us connected, I go down rabbit holes and get completely disconnected. And it often heightens my anxiety because I read 8 more stories, and I read the comments in the section that you should never read the comments. Because it's sometimes better to not know what people think about certain contemporary events. So there's these things that we can do that help us stay on the path, but Jesus is saying, but when we get disconnected, when we get separated, we help each other. It takes a village to follow in the way of Jesus. It takes a village to live this transforming way of kindness and justice and love and hope and healing. A woman, I'll call her Catherine, was telling me this story. Catherine was part of a prayer group in a church that met regularly together. And in her prayer group, they were having a meeting after the results of an election had been announced. And another person in the prayer group, we'll call her Julia. Julia was saying in the group how happy she was that a particular candidate that she wanted had won. And Catherine felt anxiety. Catherine did not want that candidate. But for Catherine, one of the main reasons she didn't want that particular candidate is that candidate had supported and championed legislation that would diminish the rights of LGBTQ folk. And Catherine's daughter was a woman married to a woman, and also a member of that congregation. And Catherine had known Julia for a long time, and they've been in that faith community for a long time. And Catherine felt this anxiety bubbling up. She didn't know what to do. She found, though, after they were leaving the prayer group, she just said to Julia, I don't like how it felt like you were gloating about this candidate winning, and I find it personally hurtful that this person's going to be in office. And mentioned her daughter. And Julia said, church is no place for politics, and just sort of dismissed it. Well, Catherine then, as she's telling the story, said, she started to think of, well, fine, I just can't be friends with Julia. I don't know what to do. This is too hard. But in her own prayer, she kept having this niggling sense she was supposed to do something more. And then she talked to her daughter about the conversation, what had happened. And her daughter said, who'd known, the daughter called her Mrs. Johnson, who'd known Mrs. Johnson for her whole life, she said, well, why don't we invite Mrs. Johnson to lunch? Catherine felt a little nervous about that, but reached out, and they set up the lunch. So there was Catherine and Julia and the daughter, and they're sharing and visiting. And then Catherine said, one of the reasons I wanted to get together with you is I'm really struggling with how you supported this particular person, knowing some of the things they stand for. And then the daughter said, I'm not politics, I'm a person. And then Julia named, and was vulnerable in this place, named how conflicted she did feel in casting a vote, and started talking about how it felt like no party is really putting forth any candidate that she really ever believes in, and she doesn't really know what to do, but she couldn't vote for the other person, and she didn't like what this person stood for. Anyway, it led into this very authentic, real conversation. And Catherine said, in sharing the story, she said, we did not solve the political issue, but we helped our relationship issue because we were honest and we cared enough about each other to be in meaningful conversation. And I think that's the kind of thing that Jesus is talking about here in Matthew. It's not an easy thing. It's a hard thing. But the current thing where people just keep staying divided or don't talk about what matters or feels like they can't touch the issues, it's not getting us anywhere. So Jesus is saying, I am showing you a better way. A way where you, for your part, do what you can, stay on the path. Keep connecting with God and with other people, and stay connected with your true self as God's beloved. And then in the ways we get disconnected, call each other back. Invite each other into the meaningful, prayerful conversations. Jesus is saying it's a path forward of healing, and it's a path that we need. Come and see. Amen.